Shalom Aleichem, the Mishnah Yomi is finishing up the first chapter of Eiruvin. We are in Mishnah Tet, Mishnah number 9. Now we're talking about a camp resting for Shabbat in a bika, which is a Carmelit, not a Reshut Rabim, not a Reshut Yachid, and what they can do to allow carrying in their campsite on Shabbat. So Mishnah 9, Makifin Shlosha Chavalim. You can make a hekef, a wall, a boundary, with 3 ropes. How does this work? Zeh lemala mizeh, v'zeh lemala mizeh. So one is near the ground, then one is higher, and the third one is higher than that. Bilvad shelo yehei bein chevel chaveiro shlosha tefachim. As long as there is not a gap in between one rope and his friend, his fellow rope, of more than 3 tefachim. Now this works, this creates a mechitza through the halachic concept of lavud. Lavud means something that's close together. We can view it as if this space is closed off. The Mishnah concludes, Shir chavolim, the ovyan yoter al tefach. The size of these ropes that we're talking about, their thickness has to be more than a tefach. Kedei sheyeh chakol asar tefachim. So the whole presentation put together, the 3 ropes plus the spaces, is 10 tefachim tall. So what's going on is you have one rope near the ground, about 3 tefachim from the ground, and then you have a gap of less than 3 tefachim, and another rope, then you have another gap of less than 3 tefachim, and another rope, so it turns out the gap is a little bit less than 9 tefachim, and the ropes put together, or straps, or whatever it is, cords, is a little more than 1 tefach, so the entire business is 10 tefachim tall, and that creates a valid mechitza through lavud. Now, one time you'll actually see this in practice, if you're not camping in a bika, is on sukkot. Certain types of sukkot made out of cloth for the walls. The walls are cloth, not the schach. They will put these straps around the walls, and these straps are exactly what this Mishnah is talking about that creates a mechitza. So even if the cloth wall, which is a little bit flimsy and might be blown in the wind, it might be blown too much, according to certain halachic opinions, to be a valid mechitza for sukkot, so they would rely on these straps to create a halachic wall, a halachic mechitza, and these straps, again, would have to be a tefach total and less than 3 tefachim between each one to create this mechitza of 10 tefachim. So that's why you might see these cords, these straps, around certain cloth sukkot that you might see on sukkahs. Great, on to Mishnah Yud. Makifin bekonim. You can make a hekef, a wall, with vertical poles. Again, this is the campsite in the valley. As long as the gap between one pole and the next one is not more than 3 tefachim. Again, lavud. Lavud is like joining, and it's as if the space in between them is closed up. The Mishnah says, B'shaira dibru Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, these halachot, that you could use a horizontal or vertical ropes or poles with gaps, that's only for a shaira, only a caravan that has to camp out in the wilderness because they're traveling on a journey. But the sages say, Lo dibru b'shaira le'behove. They say it's not davka, a leniency just for travelers in a caravan. Really, anybody could use these. These are valid halachic mechitzot. These create a halachic wall. But it was hove, it was normal for people traveling in a caravan to use these methods to create a mechitza around their camp to allow them to carry on Shabbos. The Gemara brings another machmer opinion. Kol mechitza, any fence or partition, she'ena shel sheti v'shel erev, that does not have both a warp and a woof, or a warp and a weft, a lengthwise and an up and down. Eila mechitza, div Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, is not a valid wall. So he says it needs to go not just side to side, and not just up and down, but both. So if you see these lattice panels that they sell at Home Depot, etc., these lattices that are up and down, or whatever, they have both. That's according to his opinion. That's a Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda mechitza. But the other sages say, Echad mishnei devarim. They say you could rely on either the side to side, the 3 ropes or 3 straps, or up and down, these poles, and either one will create a valid mechitza in halacha. The Bartanura here brings the Gemara, which explains that the Tanakama here would allow enclosing only 5,000 square amot, which is the size of the Chatzar Mishkan, the size of the courtyard of the tabernacle in the Midbar. And the other sages would allow enclosing even more. And he brings lechalacha for a yachid, for an individual, out in a bika, he's allowed to enclose 5,000 square amot. But for a caravan, for multiple people traveling together, they can enclose as much as they need, even using a sideways mechitza or an up and down mechitza. And the Mishnah continues and concludes, Arba dvarim pater b'machane. 4 things were pater in the camp. And we're talking about a military camp. When the army goes out to war, there were certain leniencies to allow the army to function more efficiently. So what are those? Mavin eitzim mikol makom. They can bring wood, like firewood, from anywhere. It's not considered gezel. It's considered a tanai for Eretz Yisrael, that the army is allowed to gather firewood from anywhere to use for army needs. Upetorin merchitzat yadayim, and they're pater from washing their hands before the meal. Now, the Gemara actually says they're not exempt. This is the Gemara in 17b, says they're not exempt from mayim achronim, the water after eating bread. And there's a discussion there because they had melech sdomit. Melech sdomit was a very powerful salt, and they would dip their food and their bread into it. So they really, even if they were pater from washing their hands from netilat yadayim, from the al netilas yadayim, we say, before we eat bread, they weren't pater from washing after, because that's a sakana. That's not a halacha of tumah, of a reminder of tumah. It's a sakana to not get that salt in your eyes. You'll see Sfardim will say mayim achronim chova, and they're very machmir about the mayim achronim, but there's a Taisvos who says we don't have melech stomit, so the Ashkenazim rely on this, that they're not always so careful about netilat yadayim afterwards. The Mishnah adds demai. We had a whole masechta about demai. This is produce that might need to be tithed. It was purchased from an Amaretz who's not necessarily knowledgeable and scrupulous in all of the tithes. He would take Truma Gedola, the first tithe, the major tithe, that has a death penalty. We talked about there in the whole Masechta, but maybe not all the maasrots, maybe not all the other tithes. So we would separate those tithes out of doubt. But the army camp, if they got produce from an Amaretz, they wouldn't have to separate them, because we'll rely on the fact that most of the Amaretz do indeed separate the tithes. And finally, Ume Arev. They don't have to make an Eruv. So this is Masechet Eiruvin. They don't have to make an Eruv. So what are we talking about? So an Eruv is a halachic mechanism we're going to see in this Masechta to join reshuyot, to join ownership, to share ownership. So if there's 2 or 3 houses in one chatzer, they could make an Eruv chatzerot by sharing food. They'd put food in one of the houses in the chatzer that's all jointly owned, that belongs to all of them, and that's a halachic mechanism to share ownership over this property to allow carrying on Shabbat. So the camp, the army camp, they don't have to make the Eruv. They don't have to set this up as a leniency. It's a rabbinical enactment, so they don't have to set it up, as long as, again, they have this mechitza. They have the poles, they have the ropes, they have something around their camp to allow them to carry on Shabbat, even without making a joint ownership over it. However, the Gemara explains they still need an Eruv techumin. So techum is based on a deraisa, based on a pasuk. So if they want to go beyond the techum of their camp, they would still need to set that up. Shkoyach Rabosai, sei gesund.